Hello, today I'm going to talk about St Mark. I don't know quite how well that shows up, but can you see him there with his customary lion? Sadly, this lion doesn't have wings. Anyway, that's St Mark. The lion motif is about Mark's depiction of John the Baptist as a voice crying in the wilderness. And so one who roars like a lion. So that's the thinking behind it. Now, often, as I said just now, the lion is winged, but in that picture it was just a rather beautiful lion, and I really like the picture, and I like the idea of Sir Mark as this slightly old Father Christmassy bloke with a big white beard and white hair. But there you go. There are all sorts of other depictions of St Mark, some of which are on my screen. So I'm just going to turn this round and see if we can see them on the screen behind me. I don't know if you can pick any of those up, but there you go. Sadly not quite as brilliant as Zoom and other bits and pieces there. So today what I want to do is talk about St Mark. St Mark is the patron saint of Egypt, of Venice, of Italy, of attorneys, barristers and notaries, captives, glaziers, impenitents, insect bites, lions, funnily enough, scrofulous diseases, whatever they are, secretaries, and stained glass workers. He's also known as John Mark in some areas. Now, what I want to do is just talk a bit about him, because there's a degree of controversy surrounding St Mark, less so today in the 21st century than towards the sort of 1950s, 1960s. What used to be thought was that Matthew was the first gospel. Matthew, and then Mark came along and preceded it, or gave an executive summary. But scholarly research and reflection and work has produced a completely different understanding of the Gospel of Mark. They say that it's the first Gospel, that it was written, and actually dates are anywhere now between 45, which is set as fairly early, and 75. 75 being late, 90 is a very vague possibility, but that's really on the outside of possibilities. I like to think it was written somewhere around about 50, 55, but there's no reason really to worry too much about when it was written. But it was the first gospel. It tells the story of Jesus a bit like Alistair MacLean or Desmond Bagley, a man caught in a situation which is rolling him along, and it's a page turner, and he does this and then this happens and immediately he does that. That's the nature of Mark. Mark tells the story of a revolutionary leader, a leader who is building a following in the countryside, a bit like a guerrilla leader without the rifles and the weapons. Jesus speaks to great crowds in the countryside. People come to hear him in Mark. People gather about him, and he builds this following, this great country crowd of folk who are known as the oikos or oklos. I like to think of them as a bunch of oiks, but actually the real oiks were the people in Jerusalem and the crowd in Jerusalem who gave him over to be crucified. It's a great shame that in Mark the following, the oikos that Jesus had built up seemed to melt away along with the disciples when it comes to the crucifixion. So who was Mark? The basic thinking is that he was a companion of St Peter, although quite a lot of modern scholarship again would dispute that. They think that he wrote the first gospel from the Patron or St Peter's perspective, using stories and accounts from St Peter. Some say that he was asked to do this by the Roman Christians, give an account of the life of Jesus through the eyes and from the stories of St. Peter. Some say he was a pal of St. Peter's or a follower of St. Peter's who wrote down like a secretary or an amanuensis everything that St. Peter said and then chronicled it, maybe not in the most fabulous order. And there are bits of Mark that are really interesting. Around Easter time, we have a part of Mark from chapter 13, which is known as a mini-apocalypse. This is where Mark deals with something very in much the same vein as Revelation, which leads one to another sidebar, which is when was Revelation written, when was the Gospel of St. John written, and were they contemporaneous? Were Mark and John working at around about the same time in different places? There is another, talking of places, there's another tradition that sets Mark in Caesarea Philippi, because his grasp of the geography around there is perfect. And he seems to be talking in his gospel to both Christian Jews and just Gentile Christians. And the reason that people think this is that in some parts of Mark's Gospel there's some fairly careful explanation of Jewish practices, and in other parts of Mark's Gospel there's an assumption that people know what the Passover is, what this is, what that is, what this Jewish practice is. So there's a suggestion nowadays that rather than just being written for Gentiles, it's written for both audiences, which again could place it quite arguably in and around Caesarea. Now, I love St. Mark. I love the story that he tells. I love the whole rumbustious nature of the gospel, and I commend it to anybody as the first one to start with. It doesn't waste much time. It doesn't go into great scholarly discourses like St. John does. But it does in chapter 13 have this mini-apocalypse, which is always worth a look, where Jesus talks about the temple and how it will be cast down. There's an element of prophecy. There's an element of looking forward that others have suggested date the gospel post 70. If Jesus was a prophet, why would you want to undermine his prophecies by suggesting that actually Mark was putting words into Jesus's mouth? I don't think that's the case. Other themes that Mark picks up are just how dense sometimes the disciples are. They're very faithful, they're committed followers to this itinerant rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, but they really don't get who he is and what he's about. There are themes of complete lack of understanding that run right the way through Mark, and it's not just Peter who's shown up as vaguely over-enthusiastic and apt to jump to conclusions. There are others in the gospel, James and John for instance, and others, all the disciples really, who are shown up as being a bit simple and a bit slow to grasp what Jesus is saying to them. He tells them 3 or 4 times in Mark's gospel what's about to happen in terms of the crucifixion, and they just completely miss it. And that's quite sad, and it's typically human, because if someone told you that they were going to die and rise again, even these days, what would you think? You'd think they were nuts. Well, there you go. Commend Mark's Gospel to you, commend St. Mark to you as either a friend of Peter or someone who'd heard and followed Peter for many years and then chose to write this Gospel. There's one more thing I want to suggest, that maybe Mark's Gospel was a response to the letters of St. Paul. St. Paul was writing letters that were telling everybody how to be Christian, what to do, and I think that maybe Mark and possibly John as well both sort of looked at it and went, hang on, who is this guy Paul? He wasn't there with us, he wasn't there with Peter, he wasn't there with me, John, at the foot of the cross. So why is he deciding what is and isn't right about Jesus Christ? So we are going to write what's right about Jesus Christ, and we are going to tell that story. And John and Mark told completely different stories, but all show, in fact, they both show that Jesus was a loving, caring individual who believed, and who we believe is the Son of God. who died to save all of us. So I hope you enjoyed that little trip round St Mark. It was a little sort of bitty and bobby, but that's the way of it when you're trying to talk about a famous person 2,000 years ago. You don't know everything, you can only infer. But what we do know is that Mark wrote the first gospel, the first good news of Jesus Christ, and we can be confident and secure in that. Thanks for listening. Bye.